In today's video, we explore 5 animals that became the worst serial killers of all time. From a silverback who mauled multiple men in the forest of Virunga, to a pride of lions that turned on a group of poachers in Zimbabwe. But first, we begin in the Peruvian Amazon, where a remote jungle mining camp ignored the growls outside their tents until the jaguar began taking men one by one. It was a humid March morning in 2015 in the Peruvian rainforest around the Tampobada River. The Esperanza mining camp, nothing more than canvas shelters and makeshift equipment, sat hidden deep in the jungle of Madre de Dios. What the miners didn't realize was that they had unknowingly established their camp in the territory of one of South America's most powerful predators. Carlos Quispe, a 34-year-old former electrician from Cusco, had turned to illegal gold mining after the birth of his third child. 8 years of managing remote mining operations had earned him respect among the Quechua workers who followed him into the jungle's depths. Carlos ran a tight operation, paying his men fairly and maintaining discipline, except for one fatal oversight. Food scraps and waste were routinely dumped just beyond the camp's perimeter, a practice he considered insignificant. The 23 miners under Carlos's supervision were highland men with little jungle experience. Early March, the camp cook Miguel noticed large paw prints circling their waste pit. The prints were brushed away with nervous jokes, but several miners reported hearing heavy breathing outside their tents at night. On March 16th, a bag of fresh fish scraps was torn open and dragged into the forest, a clear sign that something large had become habituated to their presence. Jaguars are opportunistic hunters that adapt their behavior based on available food sources. The constant presence of food scraps combined with the miners' predictable routines had created the perfect conditions for tragedy. Unlike other big cats that kill by suffocation, jaguars possess the strongest bite force of any feline, over 1,500 pounds per square inch, allowing them to crush turtle shells and caiman skulls with ease. Their rosette-patterned coats provide perfect camouflage in dappled jungle light, and they hunt primarily through ambush, capable of dragging prey twice their weight through dense undergrowth. Carlos told his men to work in pairs and keep their machetes close, but he made no changes to their waste disposal practices. They had no satellite communication, and the nearest civilization lay 4 days upriver through treacherous jungle terrain. Among the miners was Tupac Condori, 26, a quiet father who had volunteered for the dangerous early morning water shifts. At 4:30 a.m. on March 18th, Tupac stepped outside his canvas shelter to relieve himself. He never returned. At sunrise, his bunkmate discovered drag marks in the mud leading toward the tree line, along with Tupac's torn shirt and a single boot. There had been no struggle, no screams in the night, just the silent efficiency of a perfect predator. Carlos followed the blood trail until it vanished into the impenetrable undergrowth. Despite searching till noon, they found no trace of Tupac's body. 2 days later, as dawn fog blanketed the riverbank, brothers Amaro and Inti Kupa were working the sluice when death struck without warning. The jaguar exploded from behind a fallen tree with devastating speed, pinning Amaru before its massive jaws clamped around his neck. Inti screamed and hurled rocks at the predator. Within seconds, the cat had dragged Amaru's lifeless body into the jungle's green depths. Carlos ordered the remaining men to stay close to camp, but the jungle pressed in from all sides. On March 22nd, while organizing another search party, a sharp scream pierced the morning air. A miner named Chuya Mamani had ventured into the East Trail to collect firewood. Witnesses watched in horror as the jaguar's weight drove him to the ground, his arm raised in futile defense before powerful jaws closed around his throat. The predator vanished into the forest, with Chuya's body hanging limp from its mouth. By nightfall, Carlos made the decision to abandon Esperanza. The surviving 19 miners packed what they could carry and began the 4-day trek to Puerto Maldonado, avoiding ranger stations to prevent arrest for illegal mining activities. Upon reaching civilization, the group scattered, some returning to highland villages, others disappearing into new camps deeper in the jungle. Carlos reported the deaths to a contact at a local tabloid, but the story was buried under vague language about jungle incidents. The Ministry of Environment labeled the deaths as unconfirmed disappearances related to unauthorized operations, fearing that detailed reports might cause panic or drive miners toward sanctioned sites. No autopsies were performed, no investigation launched. Their bodies were never recovered. Months later, jungle vines had reclaimed the abandoned Esperanza site. A mold-stained tarp still hung from a tree like a funeral shroud. Blood-streaked branches marked where Chuya had made his final stand. Local guides now refused to camp within 5 miles of the location. The particular jaguar responsible had likely become habituated to human presence through the camp's poor waste management, transforming from a reclusive forest dweller into an active predator of humans. Carlos returned to Cusco that May, never to work in the jungle again. The jaguar had taken 3 men in silence, and 4,000 miles away beneath the tangled canopy of a mangrove delta, another predator waited as honey harvesters stepped into its domain, vanishing beneath jaws. It was November 15, 2018, the tide creeping slowly through the twisted roots of the mangroves as salt-thick air hung heavy with the stench of decay. In a shaded clearing beyond the riverbanks of the Sundabarans, 10 men stirred nervously around their makeshift camp of netting and driftwood, speaking in hushed whispers as they worked. They were licensed honey collectors from the outskirts of Kulna deep into the final days of their seasonal permit. But something in the forest had changed. Rashid Molla, a 38-year-old veteran of the trade, had led government-approved expeditions into the Sundabarans for over a decade. The work was brutally hard and carried constant danger, but it paid better than fishing or farm labor. Rashid knew the tides, the bees, and the risk, including the rare but deadly threat of tiger attacks. He was no stranger to close calls, but even he had grown uneasy. This trip included his younger brother Kareem and 8 others from their village, all determined to finish the season strong. Forest rangers had already warned them to stay clear of the southwest block due to increased tiger activity, but their usual zones had yielded little honey. Time was running out. With careful paperwork, they'd extended their permit by a few days, hoping to make one final harvest near a freshwater inlet. They strung nets, hung smoked fish, and lit fires to keep insects away, intent on filling their drums before the next inspection. Unbeknownst to them, they had set up camp dangerously close to the den of a nursing tigress. The Sundabarans, home to 100 to 120 Royal Bengal tigers, forces rare proximity between humans and predators. A full-grown tigress can weigh over 300 pounds and deliver a bite with more than 1,000 pounds of pressure, easily enough to crush bone. These tigers, adapted to swim, stalk, and ambush prey directly from the water, are notorious for unprovoked attacks on people. Limited prey, dense cover, and high human activity near den sites often escalate these encounters. When a mother perceives a threat to her cubs, there is no warning. Fresh paw prints appeared on November 14th, pressed into the wet clay just south of their camp. Deep, wide, and circling. Nasir Ahmed, their 41-year-old guide, confirmed the signs. A large adult female, possibly with cubs. That night, guttural roars echoed from deeper in the forest. Short, powerful calls that vibrated through the trees. Some men stopped working entirely. Rashid insisted they press on. They had 2 days left. The tigress would have to wait, so they kept collecting. On November 15th, just after midday, tragedy struck. Babul Sheikh, 30, was descending a tree with a sack of honeycomb slung over his shoulder, while Salim and Moshin worked below, still swatting at angry bees. No one saw the tigress until she exploded from the underbrush, lunging up the tree's base to catch Babul mid-descent. She dragged him to the ground with a single motion. Salim grabbed a branch and charged, while Moshin rushed in, but the tigress struck both down in rapid succession. She slammed Salim to the earth, biting deep into his hip, then turned on motion, mauling him across the back and shoulders. Witnesses described how she used her full weight to pin each man before killing with repeated bites to vital areas. Then it left into the thickets, leaving the bodies. The surviving men huddled in silence that night, stacking firewood around their boats. Karim sat awake until morning, watching the tree line. By the following morning, the remaining team had packed their equipment, desperate to leave. Each man was certain the tigress was still nearby, waiting for movement. And then, as they prepared the boats, Karim stepped into knee-deep water to untangle a rope when the tigress rose again from the creek. She seized his thigh and pulled him under in seconds. Rashid ran to help, but the water had already gone still. The others fled without hesitation, stumbling through the shallows and vanishing into the mangrove maze. 6 men reached Khulna barefoot and silent. When questioned by authorities, they explained they had been collecting honey under traditional rites, unaware that they had crossed into a restricted zone. But their account drew scrutiny. Rangers soon found torn hives, scorched bark, and abandoned tools near the attack site, evidence of recent harvest activity in a protected corridor during breeding season. A quiet investigation classified the incident as a provoked wildlife response. No charges were filed, but seasonal permits in that region were suspended. The tigress was never tracked. Her behavior was deemed natural and her territory left undisturbed. Search efforts for the missing men were limited. In the shifting tides and dense root systems of the Sundabarans, no remains were ever recovered. Families held funeral prayers without bodies, burying personal items instead. Rashid never returned to the forest. He sold his boat, gave away his gear, and walked away from the work for good. Yet, even as the honey collector's screams echoed through the Sundabaran mangroves, thousands of miles away in the Congo, a former mechanic would soon learn that some territories are guarded not just by strength, but by terrifying intelligence. It was August 14, 2016, the morning mist clinging to the western slopes of Mount Makino as the jungle canopy stirred in the humid air. Below, in a clearing carved from pristine forest, a charcoal kiln was sending smoke spiraling through the trees. 7 men had been working this illegal operation for over a week, completely unaware that they had invaded the territory of one of Africa's most powerful and intelligent predators. Shabani Kambale, a 29-year-old former mechanic from Goma, led the crew. Militia fighting had destroyed his livelihood, forcing him into the dangerous but lucrative world of illegal charcoal production deep within Virunga National Park. With a wife and 2 daughters depending on him, Shabani had little choice but to exploit the park's dense hardwood. Despite knowing the risks, he ran efficient operations, quick cuts, controlled burns, fast exits. But persistent rains and equipment failures had extended this job far longer than planned. The crew consisted of men from Goma's Nyiragongo district, including Shabani's brother-in-law Pakulu Muhindo and 22-year-old Naguda Paluku, the youngest of the group. None possessed formal forestry training, sleeping in plastic sheet shelters and working from dawn to dusk in the oppressive jungle heat. Their local tracker, Kambiri Sebanzir, had begun noting disturbing signs. Massive broken tree trunks, dung the size of melons, and the haunting sound of chest beating echoing through the night. When Kambiri warned of guerrilla activity, Shabani dismissed his concerns, insisting it was just a lone male and that it would eventually move on. What Shabani failed to understand was the nature of the creature whose domain they had invaded. Eastern mountain gorillas, especially displaced silverbacks over 400 pounds, can become aggressively territorial when threatened. Though usually peaceful, they can charge at 25 miles per hour and deliver bone-crushing bites over 1,300 psi. Unlike habituated gorillas, wild ones often see humans as threats, especially near poaching or logging zones. Having said that, they aren't typically man-killers. Experts would later say that the silverback haunting their camp had likely lost his family group due to encroachment or bushmeat hunting. a forced isolation that made his behavior more erratic and defensive. By early August, the warning signs had escalated dramatically. Heavy rustling and deep hoots echoed through their camp each night, and one morning they discovered fresh gorilla feces within 50 feet of their shelter. Kambiri urged immediate evacuation, warning that the gorilla wasn't just passing through, it had established territory nearby. But Shabani refused to abandon the loaded kiln, unwilling to lose several days of labor and the income it represented. On August 14th, Ndugu ventured alone to trim branches for a second kiln, working 60 yards uphill from the main site. Minutes later, the others heard a tremendous crashing sound followed by ominous silence. When they reached his location, they found him slumped against a tree, blood pooling beneath his shattered skull. His limbs were bent at impossible angles, and drag marks led nowhere. Kambiri pointed to a broken sapling with coarse black hair clinging to the bark, unmistakable evidence of their attacker's identity. They buried Ndugu in a shallow grave dug with machetes, then argued over whether to flee. Shabani insisted they finish the job, reasoning that they were almost done and could move quickly if they stayed together. That night, none of them slept. Paluku claimed he saw a pair of eyes reflecting from the underbrush, though no one else could confirm it. At first light on August 16th, as Shabani and Paluku loaded bags of charcoal while smoke still stung their eyes, the silverback emerged from the brush behind the kiln with terrifying silence, grabbing Paluku by the shoulders and lifting his 150-pound frame effortlessly off the ground. The other screamed helplessly as the gorilla slammed him repeatedly into a tree trunk before discarding its broken body. Paluku's chest had caved in completely, his jaw hanging loose and useless. Shabari rushed forward but froze as the massive gorilla turned toward him, chest heaving, nostrils flared in rage. This was calculated violence, a deliberate message delivered by a creature defending its home. Silverback gorillas are known to exhibit strategic aggression when asserting dominance or protecting territory, particularly when isolated from a troop. The silverback backed away slowly into the forest, disappearing within seconds. The surviving men wrapped Paluku's mangled remains in a tarp and fled without collecting their equipment, reaching Goma 2 days later, exhausted and traumatized into silence. Word of the killing spread quickly through the community. Mothers warned their sons against cutting near Makeno, while older men whispered of guerrilla spirits and ancestral revenge. But economic desperation trumped fear. Charcoal remained in high demand, and silence protected everyone from legal scrutiny. No official report was filed, no acknowledgement made by park authorities. However, under pressure from local chiefs and community leaders, Virunga Rangers were dispatched to investigate. Using trampled vegetation and fecal tracks, they located the silverback within days, less than a mile from the abandoned kiln. When they approached, it mock charged twice before holding its ground in a final defiance. A single rifle shot to the chest ended the confrontation instantly. Shabani returned to Goma and abandoned charcoal production forever, now driving a motorbike taxi through the city's chaotic streets. While the silverback's calculated violence sent charcoal workers fleeing, in Zimbabwe, a former park ranger would discover that poisoning the food chain creates predators far more dangerous than any territorial beast. It was September 23, 2017, the dry season having stripped the Metabolalon savanna to bare earth and brittle scrub. At a makeshift camp 10 miles outside Hwange National Park, 6 men moved with nervous precision around their tarp-covered shelter, eyes constantly scanning the surrounding grassland. In the oppressive silence between cicada calls, they could hear something breathing just beyond the tall grass, something that had been watching them for days. Tendai Moyo, 42, had once worn a ranger's uniform with pride, his intimate knowledge of the bush earned through years of legitimate conservation work. He knew every waterhole, patrol route, and animal migration pattern in the region. But after his dismissal following a corruption inquiry in 2013, desperation had driven him across an irreversible line into poaching. Now he led small mobile teams that poisoned elephant watering holes with cyanide, harvesting ivory from the resulting carcasses. The method was efficient, silent, and left no bullet casings for investigators to trace. His crew consisted of young men from Diti and Lupane, drawn by promises of easy money for dangerous work. Gift Sabanda, 28, had turned to illegal hunting after mining injuries ended his legitimate career. Blessing Moyo, 23, was Tendai's nephew, following his uncle into a world where survival trumped morality. Their operation had run undetected for 3 weeks, but they had failed to consider the deadly consequences of their poison on the ecosystem's apex predators. What Tendai and his crew didn't fully understand was how their cyanide-laced elephant carcasses would affect the area's resident lion pride. African lions are highly social predators that follow established hunting and territorial patterns, especially during the dry season when they rely on ambush tactics near known water sources. However, exposure to cyanide through scavenged meat can severely damage their nervous systems, affecting coordination, temperament, and cognitive function. Sublethal poisoning often results in compromised motor skills and mental confusion rather than immediate death, creating disoriented predators that may attack unfamiliar stimuli or move erratically during daylight hours. First warning signs appeared as strange tracks around their camp, dragging paws and staggered pacing that suggested neurological damage. Then came the roars. Not the distant territorial calls they expected, but urgent, repetitive bellows that echoed with pain and confusion. Simba Nakube, their unarmed tracker, recognized the behavioral shift immediately and warned the others that the lions were no longer hunting in the usual sense. They were actively searching. By the 3rd week of September, lion tracks encircled their camp each morning like a tightening noose. Simba discovered fresh scat and paw prints just behind their sleeping area. Tendai dismissed the threat, confident they would finish their work and disappear before the pride located them. But the lions had been feeding on poison elephant carcasses for weeks, ingesting neurotoxins that cause disorientation, aggression, and erratic behavior. No longer able to hunt properly and driven by confusion and hunger, they began associating the human scent and camp noise with easy targets, fixated on the men as the nearest, most accessible source of movement and sound in their failing environment. That night, a low growl passed within feet of their fire pit, followed by the distinctive cough-like roar of a distressed lion. Simba refused to venture more than 50 yards from camp, his tracker's instincts screaming danger. On the morning of September 23rd, Gift Sabanda left before dawn to check their Impala snare line. He never returned. Dube witnessed the attack from a distance. Gift had bent to examine a bush when a lioness exploded from the tall grass, her massive jaws clamping around his throat with crushing force. The other men froze in horror as the predator dragged Gift's lifeless body backward into the scrub, vanishing within seconds. In response, they built small perimeter fires and moved their tents closer together, hoping to deter the pride with light and scent. They also took turns keeping watch at night, but the lions never returned under cover of darkness. 2 days later, as Blessing Moyo skinned an impala near their camp, 2 lions approached from opposite directions with unnatural boldness. He stood with his knife raised, but the poison predator showed no fear of human presence. One lion tackled him to the ground, while the second began tearing into his stomach and chest with methodical savagery. Tendai grabbed a rifle but couldn't risk firing. Their entire operation depended on remaining invisible to park patrols. They watched helplessly as the lions dismembered Blessing, the animals lingering briefly with blood-matted muzzles before melting back into the bush. At night, they slept without a fire, listening to the distant sounds of dragging in the darkness. No one spoke of completing their ivory harvest. On September 27th, the 4 survivors, Tendai, Simba, Obvious, and Clever Nduvo, packed their remaining gear and began hiking north toward the road to Date. Moving in tight formation with rifles drawn. An hour into their escape, Clever fell behind to retie his pack. The others heard a shout followed by snarls as 3 lions emerged from the opposite sides of the trail. Clever dropped his bag and scrambled for a nearby marula tree, but his hands slipped on the smooth bark. One lion clamped onto his leg and dragged him down as the others joined the attack, tearing into his back and arms with systematic brutality. The survivors reached Dite after dusk, dehydrated and traumatized. Tendai paid bribes to keep their names from official reports, with rangers listing the deaths as hunting-related fatalities. Without recovered carcasses or confessions, the case remained sealed. By October, rangers found no trace of the pride. They had likely succumbed to the same toxins that had altered their behavior. Their carcasses absorbed by the unforgiving bush along with their victims' remains. Tendai Moyo disappeared later that year, some claiming he fled to Zambia while others believe he returned to Hwanghae alone. Simba Nakube still lives in Dite, but no longer works as a tracker. As the poisoned lions in the savannah claim their final victims, thousands of miles away in Ontario, a chemistry student would discover that some predators don't need toxins to transform into methodical killers. It was August 28, 2014, the late summer humidity hanging heavy over Ontario's backcountry like a suffocating blanket. Deep within Algonquin Provincial Park, 5 friends camped in a remote interior zone far from marked trails. They had planned a week-long wilderness retreat. No phones, no engines, just canoes, backpacks, and silence. It was meant to be a break from the noise of city life. Instead, it became something else entirely. Marcus Chen, 32, had organized the trip, a former university chemistry student turned outdoor enthusiast. He brought along 4 others, Tommy Nguyen, David Chen, Jake Morrison, and Alex Petrov, all old classmates who had drifted apart over the years. They reunited with lightweight gear and laminated maps, eager for long portages, star-filled nights, and cold river swims. Their campsite lay beside a quiet inlet ringed by spruce and jack pine, with no cell signal and no other humans for miles. By the 4th day, they'd settled into a rhythm, paddling in the mornings, fishing or hiking in the afternoons, and sharing meals by firelight. Jake Morrison, 34, was the most experienced outdoorsman among them, having volunteered with Ontario Parks during summers in university. He noticed the first signs: scratched tree bark, fresh scat, and snapped branches near their gear stash. On August 26th, he found a series of deep claw marks gouged into a pine just behind the tent line. That evening, he quietly told the others that it was likely a large male bear and that its presence might not be accidental. He watched the trees with unease, while the others tried to focus on their dinner. There had been no visible food left out, no trash pit, and no cooking near tents. They followed leave no trace principles strictly. But wild bears don't always need human error to engage. In rare cases, a black bear, especially a large lone male, will turn predatory. Whether due to age, illness, or displaced aggression, these bears may stalk and kill humans in remote zones. Weighing over 600 pounds and capable of crushing bone with a bite force exceeding 1,000 psi, such attacks are rare but often fatal. That night, they moved their food barrels further from camp and took turns staying awake, listening for movement. The woods remained eerily quiet. By morning, tension had eased. Tommy Nguyen, 25, offered to check the perimeter trail alone before breakfast. He never returned. When Jake followed, he found broken undergrowth and a blood-streaked tree. They searched as a group but found only Tommy's boot, torn nylon, and bear tracks vanishing in the dense forest. The realization hit like ice. The bear hadn't stumbled into their camp, it had been watching. Despite the horror, they convinced themselves it was a freak encounter. An ambush, not a pattern. They packed quietly, consoling each other over the loss of their friend. They were intending to leave the next day. Heavy rain was forecast overnight, and Jake insisted they wait for clearer conditions before navigating out with their remaining gear. But on August 30th, David Chen stepped away to refill his water bladder at the creek's edge. Minutes later, the bear returned. It burst from the tree line in full daylight, slammed David to the ground, and clamped its jaws around his rib cage. Bones snapped audibly as the bear shook him like prey, then began tearing into his torso with brutal efficiency. Jake and Marcus ran toward the screams but stopped short. The bear was crouched low, chewing through flesh and dragging David into the brush. Their shouts meant nothing. The animal didn't even look up. They didn't wait another night. Within an hour, Marcus, Jake, and Alex had packed what they could carry and left the site, moving fast and quiet along the portage route. No one spoke. Every sound behind them felt like breath on the neck. By nightfall, they crossed 2 lakes and made camp in silence, too exhausted to think. But the bear wasn't finished. The following day, just before sunset, Jake walked alone to retrieve gear from the trail junction. The bear was waiting. It tackled him mid-step, knocking him flat before biting into his upper back and neck. Marcus and Alex approached just in time to see the bear lift Jake off the ground, then drop him. His body stopped moving as the predator vanished into the trees once again. Marcus and Alex emerged from the forest on September 3rd, barefoot and dehydrated. Under questioning, Alex described the attacks. Search team reached the campsite days later, recovering scattered remains, shredded equipment, and bear tracks around the tent perimeter. Only Tommy and David were formally identified. Jake's backpack and blood were found, but nothing of his body remained. The official report listed 3 fatalities due to a black bear attack in a remote section of Algonquin. Despite a week-long search, the bear was never found. Rangers posted new advisories and rerouted nearby canoe circuits. Within 2 weeks, private funerals were held in Toronto and Mississauga. Tommy Nguyen's parents flew in from Vietnam and requested cremation. David Chen's memorial drew university friends, many unaware he'd gone camping. Jake's family buried an empty casket beside his grandfather's grave, leaving his hiking boots on the headstone. Marcus withdrew from school, moved home, and was later diagnosed with acute stress disorder. He left Ontario by fall. Alex remained briefly to attend memorials, then quietly relocated to Calgary before winter. Thanks for watching. If these tales of deadly beasts piqued your interest, the next video features even more gruesome predators. See ya there!